prostate, cancer of the breast. And the link between a lack of sleep and cancer is now so strong that recently the World Health Organization decided to classify any form of nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen. So in other words, jobs that could induce cancer because of a disruption of your sleep-wake rhythms. Okay. So, that's it, the immune system and cancer, but it doesn't stop there as well. We know another great study done by Eric Prather, who is over at UCSF, another good colleague of mine. He did this brilliant study that I write about in the book. He basically measured the sleep of a group of healthy people for a week before using these wristwatches that are accurate. And then he quarantined them in a hotel, in a set of hotel rooms. And then he proceeded to stuff up their nose, squirt up their nose, rhinovirus, essentially, a flu virus. And then he quarantined them for a week, and he measured how many of them became infected. And he was measuring all sorts of stuff. He collected every ounce of snot that they blew out of their nose, all of the mucus, everything. And what he found was that if those people who were getting 5 hours of sleep or less in the week before they came in and were infected, relative to those who were getting 7 hours of sleep or more, those people who were getting 5 hours of sleep in the week before they got infected were 4 times more likely to end up developing the flu than those people who were getting 7 hours or more. The final nail in that sort of immune coffin for me is a study that was done by Ev Van Carter, who's a wonderful endocrinologist. And I'd love, by the way, to speak about sleep and diabetes and glucose regulation too. She's done some great work there. But she did a great study. She looked at the amount of sleep that you were getting in the week before you get your flu shot.
Nice.
And what she found is that if you're getting sort of less than 5 or 6 hours of sleep in the week before you get your flu shot, you only produce half of the normal antibody response, rendering that flu shot largely useless. Right. Which stuns me that, and here's where technology could revolutionize healthcare. What if Kaiser, had access to a sleep tracker or had its own sleep tracker? And Kaiser, for those not familiar, is a healthcare provider here in the United States. But what if, any healthcare provider or system in any country had access to your sleep in a non-Big Brother way, and it was tracking your sleep, and through an app, it would say, hey, you've had a great week of sleep this week in December or this week in November. Now is the time to come and get your flu shot. I've listed out 3 appointments, just tap on the one that you want. Or it says, look, I know that you scheduled yourself for a flu shot. You haven't quite got the good sleep that you need this past week. Let's try again next week. And if you get the sleep next week, then you give them access to getting the flu shot. Because otherwise we're wasting money. And the flu, costs the United States, the flu season costs the United States about $10 billion directly in terms of healthcare burden. Even if I could nudge that by just 1 or 2%, by understanding people's sleep and helping architect a system that co-opts around sleep time and management, we could save hundreds of millions of dollars to the US economy.
Wow. Speaking of the flu, I think I even told you this in a previous conversation, I almost never get sick. Maybe once a year I'll get a little runny nose for a couple of days, and I've got a really good immune system, generally speaking. But this last year I had a baby, and along with having a baby comes sleep deprivation, and there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. I mean, you have to wake up multiple times to feed your baby. Yeah. And so that's what I was doing. And I got the flu, I got a cold. I was sick every month. It was crazy. I've never experienced, of course, my baby luckily was getting all my antibodies and didn't get sick, thankfully. Yeah. But it was completely connected to my sleep. Yeah,
it's the same wisdom that mothers would sort of say. They'd speak to you, and you're getting sick a lot. Are you sleeping enough? Yeah. And I've often thought that people like me, sleep scientists, all I'm really doing is putting the data behind everything that your mother and Shakespeare ever told you about sleep. I'm just putting data there. They knew it all long before the data came along. But you see that exact same thing in parents. Sickness is rife in those early years. You see it in medical residence. I think, I think a friend of yours who I enjoy listening to a lot, Peter Attia, was saying this about when he was in medical residency. And you see this in residence too. Sickness rates, increase dramatically. There is weight gain. Their diabetic profile, in terms of their ability to manage glucose, becomes markedly impaired. We know that testosterone in men plummets when sleep gets short. In fact, men who are sleeping 5 hours or less will have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior.
Wow.
Which, so in other words, a lack of sleep will age a man by a decade in terms of that aspect of virility and wellness.
How quickly does that happen? Do you know? Is that like...
So you can see that within almost days once you start to dose people on that. It comes about quite rapidly. You can see hormonal change. I mean, I think that's one of... If there is a major axis within the body that is altered by sleep, it is the hormonal axis. I think that principally through the root of the autonomic nervous system, that is the lens through which almost all sleep and sleep deprivation effects can be viewed. And I'm just starting to write up a theory paper about this, which is an encompassing theory about sleep deprivation within the human brain and the body. And I think there is a common central dictating governing pathway, which is the autonomic nervous system, through which there is a manipulation of many of the hormone systems, which then give rise to the whole host of deficits that we see by way of a lack of sleep, which then ultimately through chronic exposure of sleep loss give rise to all of the diseases that we know are associated with a lack of sleep. And every single disease that is killing us in the developed world has causal and significant links to a lack of sleep.
One that I'm particularly interested in is Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
It's something that I've been researching for a while. I'm about to get published, thankfully, soon.
Congratulations.
Soon. Thank you. But
is this a review paper?
Yeah.
Oh, please
and
send it
it
to me.
happens to do with a gene called ApoE4. And I found out that I have one copy of this allele. And when I found that out years ago, I was like, it's probably the biggest risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease besides age.
Yeah, so I think one of those alleles, it's about sort of a 2 to 3-fold risk.
2 to 3-fold.
If you have two of them, it's like an 8 to 12.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And a quarter, 25% of the population in the United States has at least one allele.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, and just because you have it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get Alzheimer's disease.
That's right.
Not everyone with it has it, but there's huge interaction with, diet and lifestyle. Probably the biggest lifestyle interaction with this gene is sleep.
Yeah.
And so that was where I became very interested in how sleep affects the brain and how it affects Alzheimer's disease and all that. So I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of this work. We have a large research program here at UC Berkeley at the Sleep Center that is devoted to aging and Alzheimer's disease. And we've been very fortunate to get many grants from the NIH here to study this. I think the story is fascinating because it's a bidirectional relationship between sleep and the pathology that we know is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So in Alzheimer's disease, there are at least 2 protein culprits that we believe are underlying the brain pathology that seems to create this thing called Alzheimer's. One of them is a sticky toxic protein called beta amyloid that accumulates in these clumps outside of brain cells. And that creates these amyloid plaques that seem to be correlated with your disease risk and disease severity. The other is a protein that we know probably less about, which is a protein called tau protein. And that sits inside of cells, and it creates a support structure for communicating and funneling many of the critical ingredients up and down your nerve cells to keep them in rude health. And during Alzheimer's disease, that protein starts to sort of fall apart and dismantle, and you get these sort of tau tangles, and the structure of the nerve cell and its ability to transport all of the ingredients that it needs to operate starts to collapse and fail. It's like a tunnel collapsing down. So one of the discoveries that we made back in 2013 was that I was looking at the distribution of this sticky toxic protein called amyloid in the human brain. And what's fascinating is that it doesn't build up in the brain homogeneously. amyloid builds up in some parts of the brain far more severely and early in the course of Alzheimer's disease, and other parts actually remain completely invaded by this thing called amyloid. In fact, parts of the motor cortex, for example, or parts of the visual cortex, you see almost no amyloid in our Alzheimer's patients. And that's probably the reason why their motor functions and their vision is unchanged. But one of the earliest places where beta amyloid builds up and then builds up most severely in late stages is back again in that medial prefrontal cortex that sits right there in between the eyes. Why was I interested in that? I was interested is because when we were doing studies where we would map with all of these electrodes over your head, we would map the deep sleep that you were having. And we could do some clever mathematical modeling of those deep sleep brainwaves, and we could try to triangulate where was the electrical epicenter of those electrical deep brainwaves of deep sleep. And it seems as though they come from all over the brain, but the principal epicenter that generates your deep sleep sits right there in the middle part of the prefrontal cortex. It is exactly the same part of the brain that accumulates toxic beta amyloid protein. Then we'd done studies, and other people had done studies before us, that had demonstrated as we age, our sleep gets worse. But not just any type of sleep, especially that deep quality of sleep that we know and we spoke about is critical for saving and learning and retaining new memories. So all of these jigsaw pieces started to get put together in my head, and I thought, we need to do some studies. Is it possible that the amount of amyloid that you have in the brain in this sleep-generating center, it should directly predict the deficit in the amount of deep sleep that you get? If it predicts the deficit in the amount of deep sleep, it should predict the deficit in your ability to hold on and retain new memories, which is a hallmark cognitive feature of Alzheimer's disease: difficulty learning, difficulty retaining. So we did the study, and that's exactly what we found. The more beta amyloid that builds up in this central frontal part of the brain, the less the deep sleep that you have. The less amyloid-related deep sleep that you had, the more forgetful you were the next day rather than the more that you remembered. So this was the first part of the Alzheimer's sleep equation, which is that Alzheimer's disease attacks the deep sleep generating regions, and you have a diminution of deep sleep, which in turn blunts your learning and memory abilities, and you become more forgetful. A far more important discovery was made by another group, far more important than the one we made, which was essentially the reverse direction, which was to say, rather than amyloid sort of decreasing sleep, could sleep actually decrease the amount of amyloid that you get? And this was a discovery that was made in rats back in 2009, I believe, was the first evidence that was published in Science. And this is a colleague, Dr. Nedergaarden, who is out on the East Coast at the University of Rochester. And she made
Hej, hvad så, Bams? Og True. Hvis du stadig er her, det er noget lang tid siden, du har skrevet. Sorry, jeg leverer noget mad.
She made two wonderful discoveries. The first was that we've known for a long time the body has a waste sewage system called the lymphatic system. But the brain doesn't have its own lymphatic system. The lymphatic system does not penetrate the brain. So where does all of the garbage, metabolic garbage go that your brain cells produce? Where's the sewage system for the brain? And she discovered it. It's actually made up of a set of cells called glial cells, which are these supporting brain cells. And so she called it the glymphatic system rather than the lymphatic system. So your brain does have a sewage system, this glymphatic system. And that's the discovery that she made. Remarkable. Then, and I'm not quite sure what motivated her to do this, she started to measure how efficient that glymphatic, that waste system was when the rats were awake and when the rats were asleep. And what she found was that it's during deep sleep that these brain cells actually shrink by almost 60% when we sleep. Blows my mind. Yeah. It's almost like, all of the buildings in New York all of a sudden shrink, and it leaves these much greater, larger areas for the cleaning crews to come in and clean up all of the metabolic detritus of the city's activity during the day. That's exactly what happens during sleep. And the cleaning solution is what we call cerebrospinal fluid. And through a pulsatile mechanism during sleep, you get a 10 to 20% increase in the bathing of cerebrospinal fluid through the brain, which washes away all of the metabolic byproducts that have been building up. One of those metabolic byproducts is beta amyloid. And in fact, if you deprive those rats of that deep sleep, you immediately get an increase in toxic beta amyloid. So now we've linked these two. I'm sorry, it's a long story, but if you're not getting enough deep sleep at night, you're not giving yourself the chance for the kind of good night and sleep clean process to remove the beta amyloid. So more beta amyloid builds up. Where does it build up? Tragically, in the very same regions of the brain that generate the deep sleep that you need to clear out the toxic amyloid. So you start getting less deep sleep, so you get more toxic protein, less deep sleep, less deep sleep. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's a non-linear exponential curve. If you look at how amyloid builds up in the brain, and if you look at the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease, it is a non-linear exponential curve. It fits exactly what the sleep-dependent model of amyloid clearance would predict if you're not getting sufficient sleep. That's the reason why now insufficient sleep seems to be one of the most significant lifestyle factors determining that. Now, you could say, by the way, those studies were in rats and you deprive them of sleep for one night. What about humans? Like, surely, well, the study has now been done. Great study done out of WashU by a team of scientists there, led by David Holtzman. And they took a group of humans and they did this very clever method where they deprived them of deep sleep, but they didn't deprive them of sleep. And you think, it sounds paradoxical. I can play you these auditory tones. Now, this is not like the memory reactivation where you play a tone and then you leave the brain alone for a while. Here, I'm just going to keep playing tones to your brain, really sort of annoying tones. But I can play them at a level that doesn't wake you up, but it lifts you out of deep sleep and keeps you in shallow sleep. So what's delightful about this method is that I can selectively excise one type of sleep, deep sleep, but I don't wake you up, so there's no stress of awakening. You are asleep for the same amount of time, but the quality of sleep is decreased.
Can street noise do that?
We don't know. Although I will come back to that when we speak about, hopefully, sleep appetite regulation, sleep glucose regulation, and sleep in low socioeconomic cultures. And I think it's possible there's a link. I think there's other factors that link poor sleep in low SES, socioeconomic backgrounds. Is noise pollution one of them? I actually think it is, untested as yet. But what they did with these human participants, they selectively removed deep sleep while keeping them asleep. So total sleep time was not changed. And then in the morning, they woke them up, they rolled them over, and they did a spinal cord puncture, a lumbar puncture, and they measured the cerebrospinal fluid. that was percolating within the spinal cord, which also goes around the brain. And you can
For man
measure the
investerer i
amount of beta
noget...
amyloid, which is a reflection of perhaps how much amyloid is there within.
Ja, det. Jeg kommer tilbage om lidt. Jeg kommer tilbage om lidt. So
in the brain. After one night of essentially a loss of deep sleep, you saw an immediate rise in the amount of beta amyloid. So it is a causal manipulation that insufficient sleep in rodents and in humans will lead to a rise in beta amyloid.
I think it was like 25 to 30% increase.
It was.
It was, yeah, it's definitely. So, of course, that's all I could think about the past 9 months.
During the,
and the buildup of
the
amyloid.
problem is, I would tell you that's the last thing you should think about. Try not to worry too much about it, because it's not to say to diminish the loss of sleep, but simply to say that worrying about it is not going to do you any good. But how do you tell that, especially to people who, have one ApoE allele?
Right.
Allele. What I would also say that's important for people, if you know your ApoE status, and if you are ApoE4, be mindful of snoring as well, because people who are ApoE4 positive, they also have a significantly elevated risk of a sleep disorder that we call sleep apnea, which is sleep disordered breathing, which is heavy snoring and then a cessation of breathing entirely. And then you gasp and you wake up again. Heavy snoring, sleep apnea is a killer. It is an outright killer. It increases your risk of basically everything you don't want: cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, and obesity. It also increases your risk of immediate death through higher risk of car accidents. So one of the other problems with sleep apnea is that you don't get the amount of deep sleep that you need.
Svinger sygt meget nogle gange, og der er ikke rigtig så meget, vi gør ved det.
Your oxygen saturation goes down. You get hypoxia damage, particularly in a region that is most sensitive to it in the brain, which is, drumroll, the hippocampus, the very same memory structure that is attacked in Alzheimer's disease. So now you can see this, why I appeal for this sensitivity and this danger to sleep.